the military does a really good job of dehumanizing the enemy, right? So when you're indoctrinated, and I saw this a lot because my other work outside of like when I left the military was I started getting into counseling, right? I was counseling combat veterans, and I worked for the vet center, and time and time again, when I was sitting across from another or a soldier or a Marine or airman or someone in the Seaman or Navy, that there was still this idea of dehumanization that they were not at a place or were not able to come to terms with, right? They still viewed the enemy as less than human.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast, Discourses of Our Time. Our discussion today is about the United States' former war in Afghanistan and what is the soldier's state of mind in that war as seen, described, and experienced by the soldier himself. For this purpose, I invited Mr. Zachary Warlow to the studio today. He served in the United States military at the rank of a sergeant in 2010-2018 and was deployed in Afghanistan in 2013-2014. Welcome, Mr. Warlow. Thank you very much for joining me today. And needless to say, thank you for your service to this country.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
I want to start our conversation with the war in Afghanistan because you have the first-hand experience in the country. What happened in Afghanistan? How did it happen that we never really lost a single battle in this 20-year-old war, but we didn't win the war either, and eventually we left the country in a manner that did? So what happens there?
There's a couple different ways I think you can answer this question, of course, like most things. So I'll try to take it from the perspective of boots on ground, soldier, and kind of what we experience. I try to incorporate that into it, right? Because obviously you have like a theoretical answer to it, and then there's kind of like the lived experience. And so the first part is I think that it depends on how you define winning and losing, right? If you consider the fact that the initial objective of going in 2001, 2003. Disband Taliban, get them out of the country, get Osama bin Laden. And we had a lot of success initially, right, in those first 2-3 years. And then it kind of became this stagnant, protracted war. And so in the end, we didn't really win anything. And so, I think some people, it depends on how you want to define it. But from the soldier's perspective, I think it partially in the same light, there wasn't necessarily a clear objective on what we were trying to accomplish, right? I think it was a little bit, even being there, it was a little bit murky exactly on like what was our final objective, right? Each company, each battalion, each brigade, each unit has their mission objectives, but what was like kind of the overall goal? And in some, even when I was there, I remember they were having elections because it was like 2013, and they were promoting because Karzai was still, he was in like his almost 15th year of power, and he was running again. And so there was the elections were happening. And I remember it was very lukewarm. It was kind of like, oh, well, we're here to support the elections or democratization, train the ANA, the Afghan Army, but it was like very lukewarm. Like the response wasn't there. Like it was. And so we're kind of like, what are we doing here? Right. I don't think we had a clear objective from my perspective. And I think that led to a lot of kind of disheartened despondence amongst the ranks as well as the Afghan people. And so even though we were much more powerful, we had better weapons, better technology, better, we weren't able to actually accomplish a goal because we weren't sure exactly what that goal was. That's just from the boots on ground.
Okay. What would you say, how much role did Afghanistan's ethnic fragmentation played in this whole American military saga in the country?
It certainly played a role. You can't get around that. I mean, the fact that Afghanistan, despite the many efforts by not just the United States, but of course, we know Soviet Union, England, Great Britain, and to try and colonize or to try and create some type of protectionist state, it doesn't work because it is a tribal society. It's a lot of tribalism. But the other thing that's unique about Afghanistan that when you experience it when you're there is that compared to say like Imperial Russia, but even the Soviet Union, there was like the nationalities policy, and specific regions and oblasts had a majority of a certain type of ethnicity, and there were kind of these delineations and these lines. Afghanistan, you don't like have that. There's a lot of more of like mixing, and there's not a clear delineation of like Pashtus is this area and Hazara is this area and Tajik is this area. Like, they congregate certain areas, but there's no clear delineation. So there's a lot of mixing. So when you're interacting with that, one day you might be interacting kind of with Pashto and Pashtuwali, which is a different kind of mindset, and the next day you're interacting with Tajik or Turkmen even, and so as an American, if you're not educated in that or you don't have that cultural understanding, it can become very difficult in how you interact with them, the expectations they have, and then despite the fact that there's a lot of tribalism, there are definitely differentiations between those tribes and how they act and their ideas and their perception. There is a macro level cohesion, though, because of all of these continuous invasions over time, and people come that they kind of rally around the fact that, like, at the end of the day, they're all Muslim, right? And I feel like that was another mistake we made in our understanding of when we were going in there and doing this democratization bit, was that they didn't view us as protectors or people, like they viewed us as just another non-Muslim entity coming in trying to oppose our will, and that was not received well. So definitely ethnic fragmentation was a part of it for sure.
So they didn't really have the common Afghan identity, so to speak. Despite of what you mentioned, they have the macro consciousness, so to speak, to unite against the invader.
Right.
But there is still no common Afghan identity. So their loyalties lay with the tribe rather than with common Afghan.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Even despite the fact that they had, what was it? Almost until about 20 years of having a, Islamic Republic with Karzai's president, and they were trying to push this pluralism and it didn't take. I mean, it just wasn't something that I think they wanted. They just didn't want it for the most part. I'm not saying you didn't have liberal sects and there weren't liberal kind of ideas or but for the most part, yeah, there is not a common nation, like a nation state that you feel connected, that they feel connected to, right? It's very much tied into their tribes for sure.
Right. Without which it's impossible to build the state.
Right.
If there is no nation, it's very hard to build the state. I mean, in the United States, we very often mix these two notions. The nation and the state pretty much are synonymous with one another, but we know that they are not. So there was no national identity, which I guess complicated the whole effort, whole enterprise of building the state, the Afghan state,
for sure,
and then the democracy.
For sure. Yeah.
So naturally, you interacted a lot with tribal leaders, tribal representatives. What it was like to interact with these people? Like, what moved them?
Well, because of my rank and like my position as a sergeant, I didn't do as much of direct, say, interaction with like the mullahs or like imams, or like I wasn't working directly with the kind of the leaders, these religious tribal leaders, but I was around, right? I did sit in on some of these meetings, and I was around, especially like when we were training the Afghan National Army. We would kind of go into they would have their own kind of compound, that would either be tied to our FOB or they would be close. We would go in and we would train, and they were and again, I think it depended, right? For the most part, when we went to their compound and we were working with them, it was always you sit down and you talk first. You have tea, there's niceties, you don't just get right down to business. When we were kind of playing in their space, they were very receptive. And I mean, they would talk about kind of their objectives and what they're playing, like what they wanted to get out of our being there and how we could work together. And there was a lot of cooperation, but I think where it broke down was, and again, because along those tribal lines, was that you might have one, tribal leader disagreeing with another tribal leader, right, on what their end objective was. And so I think, again, it added into that complexity of it where it was like, okay, well, this leader wants us to help dig a fighting position around their a compound, right? And then the other one says, well, no, because that's infringing on the land of this other, you know what I mean? And so it's like, it can get really complicated. But for the most part, when we were having like meetings, it was always very receptive and cooperative for the most part that I experienced.
There were a lot of reports that I've read quite a bit about this, that the whole military units of the Afghan army, in which United States invested massive amounts of the money and the effort and the time to build them, including also the police, the Afghan police, there were days when whole sections of entire units were gone, of Afghan American-built units. What was happening there? What was the explanation? What was the American approach, and what was the explanation from the Afghan side forces?
Far as when you say like they would like desert, you mean like they would just kind of
Yeah, desertions. I
right,
mean, right, mass desertions. Right.
right. So again, speaking just from my own perspective, one of my units, I was with it was a kind of a squad level element that we would go and train the ANA specifically with some engineering stuff, right? So we were doing some like ordnance, but also like equipment operating, things like that. And we were training them. And that was about 3 weeks that I was involved in that. Oh, well, almost a month. So one of the things that I still remember is kind of going back into what we were talking about with the different ethnicities, right? I forget who said like war is just an extension of politics, right? And so military is kind of just an extension of government. So a lot of the issues they were having with trying to build a nation, they were having in the army too, because you had Tajiks, you had Uzbeks, you had Pashto, you had Hazara, you had all of these different ethnicities trying to formulate into one national army, and it was difficult. I mean, there were times we would go there, and we would be training, say, this platoon, and of the 40, 45 members of that platoon size element, 15 might have showed up, and then the other ones were just kind of sitting around. It's like they didn't want to be trained. They didn't want to engage. I think there was a lot of apathy that set in. I think there was a lot of kind of, we weren't accomplishing anything. There was no goals being accomplished, going back to the first part. So I think apathy had a part in it. I think wanting to just go back home to their families, right? Not serving in a national army for something they don't know what's going. They want to go back to their tribes, to their families. So, and I'm not going to sit here and, I mean, who am I to blame them, right? But I think those were some of the, as from the U.S. perspective, frustrations. We were like, we want to ultimately hand this over to you, right? We're already here, this protracted war. The idea was to have the ANA, Afghan police, like be able to provide the security for their own nation, their own country. And when that wasn't happening, I think there was some frustration because we're like, we can't be here forever, right? I would say probably apathy was the thing I noticed, was just not feeling driven or motivated to want to serve.
But you would not say these desertions were deliberate act of sabotage planted by the adversary. Would you?
Not saying that couldn't have happened. That would not be my first take on it. My first take is most of the desertion was lack of cohesion, lack of motivation, and wanting to just go back to their land and their families and their people like that. To me, hey, the Taliban obviously wanted to get power back, so it's not saying that the adversaries and enemies didn't have their, maybe incels or some, that they were, but I would argue my first take was most of it was just not wanting to fight in the national army.
But they were paid, right? These Afghan soldiers, the policemen, they were paid substantially. So there was a financial motivation to serve.
There was. Yeah, there was. But I still think, but even that, yeah, in that culture, money was important, but I think there were other things that were also as important, if not more important. And I think that led to, that's my first take on it, but it could be other aspects to it. So
if you look at American military history, especially since 1960s, I think there is a clear pattern, which is our adversaries naturally realized the American massive superiority, technological firepower superiority, and they simply decided that it's not possible, it's not rational to fight against America conventionally, the ground war. So instead, they resorted to the guerrilla warfare, the asymmetric guerrilla warfare, when they exhaust the United States, inflict human casualties, much less than what they're inflicted on, but still, they drain the public, they crack, so to speak, the public confidence, they shake the public confidence, and very importantly, they inflict massive financial the drain on the U.S. national budget. After which the United States abandons the conflict and the country, and without losing a single battle, we end up not winning the war either. So we have three clear cases here. One is the Vietnam. The second one is second war in Iraq, invasion in 2003. and the third one is Afghanistan. Well, actually, first I probably should say Afghanistan and Iraq. So there's a clear pattern here. So my question is that taking these realities into consideration, can we still win the wars? Or finally, our adversaries figured out how to fight us. And without really winning the battles, they keep winning the wars.
I think there's a fair point to be made with that. I mean, I think, again, I think if we were to say, again, this is counterfactual, right? But if you were to say, okay, we go in Afghanistan, we drive Osama bin Laden out, we drive the Taliban out. That was our objective. We achieved that. Hand the reins over. We're out. Afghanistan. We would say, okay, well, we accomplished our objective, right? Like we had a clear objective, we accomplished it. I think in Vietnam, a similar pattern in that, as politics get more and more involved, and especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, how do you define the end goal of democratization, right? Other than to say, okay, Afghanistan, Iraq, you are now democratic nations. We've got war, there's no more warlordism. There is no more, we centralize power. You have elections. You have, pluralistic society. You have civil society. All the markers of democracy. Success, we won the war, we're out. It's, like that to me, like that's the end point. To me, that's why we haven't won the war, right? Because again, it goes back to what were the objectives? What was the final goal? What were we there to ultimately do, right? Because I don't know if that was necessarily completely defined, right? It was very much in this idea of democratization. With that being said, yes, I do think like if we were to get into a pure conventional warfare, clear objectives of like, say, go back to World War, where you have fascism versus democratic freedom, which I know there's a lot of complexities to that, but like that was it. Hitler was invading and there was fascism, and we had a clear goal to eliminate Hitler, get rid of fascism, right? I think that you could still win wars that way, but if it's going to become this, all right, well, you achieve some objectives and then now go build democracy. Okay, all right, that could take 100 years. Like, I mean, it could take 200 years, So I guess that would be my answer is yes, I think wars can still be won, but I think it just depends on mission objectives and what is the ultimate goal, and is there substantial evidence that you can achieve that goal, right? I don't think we had that in Iraq and Afghanistan nor in Vietnam. So I don't know. That would be my answer. I think wars can be won, but I think the types of wars that have been fought and what we've been involved in, I don't know if you can. And as far as the style of fighting us, it's proven to be very effective. Of course, like why go toe to toe with us? Especially with say in Afghanistan, Iraq, and more so in Afghanistan, they got very good at using IEDs, suicide IEDs on people, on cars, roads, everywhere. I mean, they became very good at the cat and mouse kind of. We're going to kill some of your people because they also know America. For as uninformed as a lot of our population is, and that's just a fact, the rest of the world's not that way. Like the rest of the world is actually, and I know is that they know American politics. They know the United States. They know that we care about that stuff. Like if they put an IED and they kill 10 of our soldiers in an IED attack, they know that affects us. So they're very good at it. So yes, the style of guerrilla warfare, the asymmetric warfare, is very effective against us. I think it can be defeated, but it takes clear objectives and good leadership. That'd be my capping of that answer. Yeah.
Yeah, open societies, democratic societies always had trouble fighting wars because public opinion matters and adversaries know where to press the button, how to influence the public opinion, which is protracted guerrilla warfare to exhaust this public opinion. Yeah.
Yeah. Very effective. Very effective.
Yeah, that's exactly. That's what has been proven in Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq repeatedly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What is, I know you're not serving in the US military anymore, you are retired from the military, but you still have pretty good knowledge of what is taking place there. And there are not some good news coming out from the US military currently. What is the current state of the military? We have the statistical evidence that recruitment was down 25% in 2023 alone. Our ammunition supplies are depleted due to the American effort to help Ukrainian war effort against the Russian invasion, and generally combat readiness of the military is down. What would you say is happening there?
I mean, you can't, numbers don't lie, right? Evidence. I mean, to your evidence is perfectly clear that our volunteer force is struggling, and it's a massive problem that we should all care about. And it amazes me how a lot of people they don't know it. They don't think about it. They don't understand that you can't just not have a military, right? And so, um, this is a problem. I will say I think that ebbs and flows, right? I mean, we know, like with Vietnam, when public opinion, I guess, which is a huge factor in this, right? When you lose confidence in the military, recruitment goes down, right? People are less inclined to want to join. We saw in Vietnam, and then you saw an uptick in the Gulf War, when patriotism, there was a lot more patriotism, or at least a feeling of more connection with that Americanism, that American spirit. We saw it after 9/11, recruitment went up, right? So I think there is an ebb and flow. I do think this one, there is a deeper level to this. Like when I talk to younger generation, people that are in their late teens or 20s, early 20s, yeah, I think there's just a lack of confidence. I think a lot of people view the military as, at least currently, not an institution of success. I think there's obviously, a thought of why go fight if I don't believe in what we're doing, or so I think there's general lack of confidence. People aren't wanting to join, and then there's the other. So that's from that perspective. The other component is also what the military is doing, right? And I think the military as an institution, I think, has gotten more lax in some areas, specifically with readiness and training. I think there's been kind of a lack of creativity on their part on how to reach hearts and minds. And then there's also the financial component, right? Because in the United Finance, money matters. And when you're an E5 sergeant, right, like I was, and you're making between $35,000 and $38,000, right, to serve, and you're in, say, Afghanistan, Iraq, or wherever, and you're fighting a war, and then you see contractors over there that are doing the same job, getting paid $150,000. You start going, well, okay, well, I'm getting paid like crap. And so I think it's also like, if, start paying more, start paying, I think, a little more adequately. Benefits are great, but obviously benefits aren't reaching hearts and minds anymore, right? So like I think there has to be more creativity. You have to have a different approach. I think you have to pay, so I think there's a lot of pieces to it, right? A lot of pieces. And there's people out there much smarter than me that have been debating and looking at this from all different angles. And I don't know if there's a clear answer, but those are just some of my interpretations and thoughts towards it, of some things that are wrong, and potentially ways we could start working on it at least a little bit.
The way we left Afghanistan was, in my view, unmitigated political, military, and psychological disaster. I don't think that there is any other way to look at it. You are not only a soldier, but you are, by your training and education, the scientist. How do you think the way America withdrew from Afghanistan impacted America's national prestige and the international political developments generally in the immediate aftermath of withdrawal from the country, from Afghanistan?
There's a feeling of anger there. I mean, there's a little bit of anger, frustration just with that, again, because it's like, the losses were so quick. The Taliban regained control and centralized power so quickly that it was like, what were we doing? And so I think, even just from a personal standpoint, it was like, there's a feeling of loss there, and a feeling of, it sucked, it kind of hurt type deal. But even then, taking that and look from a more, say theoretical, or more kind of looking at as a whole, right? I think it looked weak. The confidence in the military was already low. I think that made it even lower. It brought that down even more within our own population. I think around the world, I think it made us look weaker. With that being said, I don't know what the end result would have been anyway, right? In my opinion, I feel like the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Bush administration, to an extent, all avoided this. But all these other administrations, I think, also avoided this because I think they saw the writing on the wall, right? It was like, we've been here 20 years. The confidence in democratization and democracy building has not increased. The centralization of power was not occurring. The pluralism, the civil society that we were hoping to build was not occurring. all of these markers were not happening, right? And so what was the end result going to be? I mean, and so again, I think I don't know what the end objective would have been anyway, but it still doesn't make it any better. Like it still is a disastrous end. I mean, there's just no other way to put it, right? But I think the seeds of that were 10, 15 years in the making. I don't know. That's my opinion on it.
I'm tempted to throw in the speculative the question. Do you think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine would take place if we did not leave the way we did? Do you think that it emboldened Russia when it saw such a massive weakness, the total failure on part of the United States? Do you think it emboldened Russia?
That's an interesting perspective. I mean, that's definitely an interesting question. I mean, the timing of it certainly, and I mean, also, I think to clump into that, you could even say with the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel as well, because let's face it, I think all of us can understand that there's other powers behind that as well. Iran. I mean, so, is there this emboldened strategy? Is that I think you could make an argument for it. If the United States, and again, this is just maybe a little over dramatization, but like if the United States can't even build a democracy, say in like Afghanistan, or can't achieve its missions there, why fear it? Why have any fear over our ability to protect or defend, right? I will say in the same breath as that, though, when Putin decided this and when this invasion occurred, I don't think he expected the response that he did get from the EU and NATO and the United States. That's my I don't think he expected the initial response that we did have towards it. But I think you can make an argument. Sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, adversaries always watch their adversaries and they take note of every action, especially if the action is perceived as a weakness, which definitely Afghan withdrawal was perceived as a weakness.
And I think we can't also lose sight of the fact of the failure in Iraq too. I think that I think that was almost maybe a bigger blemish too, But yeah.
I have several more micro level, individual level questions, so to speak, to come down from a geopolitical level. You saw action in Afghanistan in the combat zones. What is it like to be in the middle of the combat? What goes on in the mind of a soldier under fire?
That's certainly a subjective kind of answer, of course. I mean, I think how people respond to say being under fire or traumas is as unique to them as how they laugh. They laugh. I mean, it's like there's definitely a certain amount of subjectivity to that. What I will say is, from my own kind of my own perspective, my own experiences, I think there's a confidence that you have, right? There's a certain, you maybe you're a little green, right? We always say they're a little green, you go over there, you're green, because you're just in theater, you're just there, and you're training, you're with your unit, there's a confidence there, and I think that confidence certainly carries you. But when you start getting into some hairy situations, you start getting into, or if you do, you come under fire, fear. I mean, fear is that you can't get around that. There is an existential fear that I don't care, everybody feels it. And that's where you hope that your training, you hope that that confidence, right, that you have going in kind of pushes you through. But there is just a fear. I mean, it is definitely a fear. And now I think, there are guys that have seen a heck of a lot more combat than me, guys that have been in some thick trenches and have really, and I do think over time, I mean, I think you get more confident in your abilities, or you go through it more times, and your leadership has a big part in it. But there's always fear. There's always a feeling of what the hell's going on? What am I doing? That's a fear. But that's probably the one thing that is common. How you respond to that is very unique. It's unique to every person. I mean, every individual, and how they respond to that.
How do you manage that fear? And the fear of the death is no longer some abstract concept when you are under fire. It's right there and in front of you. How do you manage that fear?
I think that there's a book. Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. I don't know if you're, it's called On Killing, and it's a very popular book. I mean, he talks about this a lot better than I ever will. But I mean, as far as my experience and what he writes is, I think there's a lot of truth to it. Is I think part of it is training, right? So the type of training you go through, especially the military, because they have not perfected, but they've gotten very good at, even in training, starting to condition your mind, right? Starting to condition your mind for what that's like. I mean, there's one training where you literally are crawling on the ground and they're firing live rounds within a foot and a half above you, right? And you're crawling for a couple hundred yards while there's explosions. And I mean, that's part of the training, right? And so, it's this conditioning. So training's one part of it that helps to at least build your confidence. Part of it's leadership, right? The confidence in your leadership, but also the ability for your leader to take on some of that fear, right? Because, when you're there, the stronger the leader, the more confident you feel. So I think leadership's a part of it. Group dynamics. You're in a group. So you don't feel alone. You don't feel isolated. That can help. That plays a part. And then some of it is just the constitutions of the individual themselves, right? I mean, I've said before, I don't think the military is for everyone. I don't think everyone should serve. I don't think everyone's in a position to want to be in that type of position either, right? So, yeah, I mean, again, I don't think there's a clear answer, but I think leadership, I think group dynamics, training and confidence, and then I would say your own resolve, your own ability to take that fear and use it almost productively, right? Because you can't get rid of it. You can't throw fear out. It's how you use it, in the moment, and how you engage with that fear.
What is the American soldier's regular day in a combat zone?
It definitely depends on mission, depends on the unit, depends on what you're doing, depends on the season, depends on Ramadan, right? Like Ramadan's a whole different ball game. But I would say on average, if you get to sleep a couple hours, you wake up, you eat a little something. And then if you have a mission coming up, you're doing preventive maintenance on, say, vehicles or your weapons, right? You're cleaning weapons, you're keeping your gear, you're constantly going through your gear, you're constantly making sure you've got the right things you need for that particular mission, or you're making sure everything's, tight so nothing's loose, when you're patrolling, or if you're, you make sure your weapon's always clean. So you're doing a lot of preventive maintenance, making sure you're ready for missions. And then, of course, you go on a mission. Missions can be, if it's a patrol, like, for example, like route clearance, like if you're route clearance for IEDs, you could be on the road for 8-9 hours, right? Just going like a couple miles, right? Or, a patrol through a city could take 2-3 hours. Or if you're building something, it depends. Missions take different amounts of time, but there's certainly a lot of downtime too. I mean, at least my experience, there was definitely a lot of downtime, where if, my unit didn't have a mission, there might be a week in between when we have like a mission set, right? And during that week, work out, go to the gym, play cards. You read. I did a lot of reading. I mean, so yeah, I think it depends. But Ramadan was an interesting time because we were running pretty much 24-hour ops at that point. And there were times where we might be on the road like 2-3 days straight, sleeping in our trucks. Or so again, it depends on the time, depends on the seasons, depends on what we're doing. But that's about the average.
Okay. There are lots of the faithful serving in the American military. I mean, the people who belong to different Christian denominations and non-Christian denominations. And I know that you are a Christian, or you are a practicing Christian, which I respect. My question is that how does a Christian reconcile one of the central commandments of the Christian faith of thou shalt not kill, and the possibility and demand, I would say, of a battlefield that you may have to take someone's life, even if that person on the battlefield came with the sole purpose to kill you? Because commandments, the religion is pretty uncompromising about it. It says thou shalt not kill. It does not say you can kill now. We'll talk about it later. It's thou shalt not kill. So how does a soldier, the faithful, reconcile this commandment with the demands of the war?
I will, again, plug in. I will say the On Killing book. He does go into this a little bit as far as he comes from a perspective of the psychology, right? A psychological perspective, which is I think again not the end answer to that, but it certainly provides a kind of a way of thinking about it that I think is fairly accurate. With that being said, when it comes down to like a spiritual component of that, right? That's very individualistic. I mean, you kind of have to find your own peace with that. There's not, I think, a right or wrong answer to it. I mean, I think it's for every person. The military does a really good job of dehumanizing the enemy, right? So when you're indoctrinated, and I saw this a lot because my other work outside of like when I left the military was I started getting into counseling, right? I was counseling combat veterans, and I worked for the vet center. And anyone who doesn't know what vet centers are, they're great. They're a resource to the VA in which combat veterans provide counseling to other combat veterans. So I was I was the counselor, right? And time and time again, when I was sitting across from another a soldier or a Marine or airman or someone in the Seaman or Navy, that there was still this idea of dehumanization that they were not at a place or were not able to come to terms with, right? They still viewed the enemy as less than human. And that happened many times. And it was part of the counseling. And I went through it myself, certainly, to an extent. You have to come back to the reality of that they are human, and that what you were asked to do was extraordinary and being able. So part of my job was trying to help people come to that, but really it's very personal. That's a very personal thing that every person who has had to go into that situation has to find for themselves, right? So I would say it's very personal. I will say the psychology of it, I do think there is a universal component to it where the ability to dehumanize the enemy, the ability to diffuse responsibility into the group, right? Which he talks about the group dynamic, your leadership, right? Your leadership taking that on, like I was saying, where like as the captain or as the major, you take some of that on for your soldiers, right? Even NCOs, you do that a little bit, right? With your lower enlisted, but some of that's part of it. But really, it ultimately comes down to you finding that for yourself. And a lot of people struggle with it. I mean, that's PTSD. I mean, a lot of people struggle with it, for sure.
Right. I mean, the dehumanization itself contradicts the Christian principle also. It does not allow to dehumanize another one. So that's another layer of this inner struggle, I guess, which, as you mentioned, is kind of unresolvable inner conflict for anyone.
Right. And I mean, certainly like the religion, and I mean, that's a war is hell. And, they say that and it's turned into kind of a cliche thing, but it's true. I mean, it's hard to see religion and spirituality when on a battlefield, right? I think, again, you can go into deeper levels of how you view the universe and God and the world, right? And that can maybe offset some of that. But it's contradictory. And I think every person has to find that for themselves. It's a very personal journey for sure. Yeah.
It's St. Augustine who has a principle of just war. But still, if it's a just war in anyone's mind, it still eventually comes down to killing someone, taking someone's life.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even just wars, you're still taking a life of someone who had a family and had a history and all that stuff, and you can't lose sight of that. I will say one of the things that here in the United States, I think we definitely lack is when you look over historically, even as far back as say like wars. I forget there was a certain tribe, and I don't want to misquote it, but there was a certain tribe I remember reading in Africa where they had a ritual, right? So when they would have a battle with say another tribe, if you took that person's life, you would have to take in their child or their daughter and actually help like for a year. I think it was like up to a year actually raise them, right? So like it was a ritual. And that's just one example, but there's all these kind of little rituals historically like that, a way to make amends for the loss that you created, right? And I think in the United States, there's nothing like that, right? I mean, you go through this, you do these things, and then you're just out there, right? There's no end, there's no ritual, there's no way to make amends to the lost soul or the person that you had to take their life ended. It's an interesting thing that I had read before, and I thought, that's true. We don't have any kind of ritualistic end to it, right? So I think in some ways it's like, how do you make amends for that person?
Yeah. Would you encourage the regular American youngster to join the US Army, what would you tell them?
Yes, I would. I would. I want to say that right off the bat. I would. Oh, simply because there's of course utopian ideals, and that's fine. That's fine. Like we can always strive to, and maybe someday in the near 100 years or 1,000 years, we'll get to that, utopian socialistic kind of communal, where we're all peace and we're all. But let's face it, that's not the reality. And so, if you want to protect for modernity's sake, you want to protect your family. You don't even care. It might not even be about the government, but your family, your land, your culture, your everything. Like you want to serve that. Right now, military is not the only way. I mean, you can serve it in other ways. So maybe my argument would be find some way to serve. Right, some way to serve your community, your culture, your history, your country. Right. Anyway, any number of ways, but military is certainly one way to do it. So I would encourage, but it doesn't have to necessarily be infantry, right? You don't have to be a Green Beret, you don't have to be a Navy SEAL, you don't have to be an infantry. You can be in sciences and technologies, and there's other ways to serve. But I would definitely encourage people to want to serve, even if it's just a minimum 4 years, right? Just give back. I think it's a way to stay connected to your community, a way to stay connected to your country. So yeah, I would say yes. That would be my answer to that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Warlow. Thank you. I appreciate you coming to the podcast. Thank you for an interesting conversation. Thank you all for joining in. Please do not forget to hit the subscribe button down below, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you.